Chosen ones, the silence you feel pressing against your spirit tonight is not empty. It is coded. Long before satellites traced the skies and governments tracked the pulse of humanity, a quieter institution was already tracing you. The Vatican did not look with the eyes of men, but with the compass of sacred geometry, seeking the precise measure that marked you as different. They whispered that numbers themselves breathe, that shapes conceal voices, and that in the angles of cathedrals and basilicas lies a forgotten script. Not ink, not parchment, but ratios and spirals carved into stone. Each golden proportion was not only an aesthetic, it was a signal. The faithful bowed in reverence, never realizing they knelt beneath encrypted patterns meant for a future generation. That future is now, and the measurements were not of buildings, but of you. Deep within sealed archives, diagrams older than Rome's own power trace the same geometry pulsing through your body. They call it the design of heaven upon earth. Yet, those with eyes sharpened by prophecy know it was always a map toward a specific people, a chosen geometry for a chosen flame. But here is what unsettled the corridors of power. These discoveries did not remain confined to bishops and monks. A signal was sent across the ocean, through channels unknown to the public, into the ear of a president. He was told there is a living pattern moving through the world, embodied in certain ones whose very breath aligns with the unbroken circle. And while the Vatican traced you, governments feared you. For the geometry is not silent anymore. It trembles. It vibrates beneath temples, across grids of cities, within the structure of your bones. Those who knew dared not speak. Yet silence cannot contain what was written before empires rose. There are codes hidden not in books, but in the silent sweep of a compass across parchment, in the straight line that bends only to meet a circle, in the golden ratio etched across centuries of design. The ancients whispered that numbers are alive, that geometry is not a human invention, but a language carried from heaven. Within the Vatican vaults, these patterns were guarded, diagrams layered with symbols that spoke of power greater than kings and councils. The priests called them holy. The architects called them perfect. But those who knew the deeper current understood them as encrypted messages waiting for the appointed ones to awaken. The cipher begins where line meets arc, where triangles form the unseen trinity of energy, matter, and spirit. Cathedrals were built not only as places of worship, but as resonating chambers tuned to this hidden frequency. When you walk their halls, the angles hum, the arches breathe, the rose windows turn sunlight into a wheel of code. Every step echoes a rhythm the mind cannot hear, but the soul remembers. This was not by chance, but by calculation, by sacred intent woven into the very stones. For centuries, they waited for the day when the cipher would be read, not by mathematicians or priests, but by living vessels carrying its pulse within. The Vatican scholars traced star maps and earth grids, aligning them with the human form, discovering that the very proportions of your body mirror the golden design. Hands stretched, arms wide, the measure of man itself becomes scripture, geometry unfolding as destiny written in flesh. What terrified them most was not that the pattern existed, but that the pattern was alive, breathing, incarnate in certain ones governments were told quietly, as if it were a warning and not a revelation, that the cipher matched living people scattered across the earth. It was not a theory, but a living alignment, a geometry that moved and spoke and dreamed. The president was not briefed about religion, but about architecture, energy, and human resonance. Yet he knew enough to understand that what the Vatican traced was no myth, but a power that could not be contained. And if the cipher has already revealed itself, if the sacred geometry is no longer bound to temples but to you, what will unfold when its hidden equation is finally completed and the last missing line draws itself across the world? The night was heavy with silence when the message reached the president. It was not carried through official channels, not stamped with seals or signed by generals, but delivered through a voice that bypassed the protocols of government. The words were careful, stripped of ceremony, and yet they carried the weight of empires. The Vatican had traced a living geometry, and it was no longer confined to stone. The president leaned back in the dim glow of his office lamp, his eyes fixed on a report that read more like prophecy than intelligence. It spoke of spirals that could not be broken, of a ratio embedded in flesh and blood, of people whose very existence aligned with the architecture of heaven. The briefing unsettled him because it did not concern borders, armies, or weapons. It was something far older and infinitely more dangerous. His advisors whispered that this was not about politics, but about design, that the Vatican had uncovered what they called the human cipher of destiny. The words lingered in his mind, pressing against him like an unseen hand. He asked for verification, for proof beyond parchment and diagrams, and what they handed him instead was testimony. Accounts of dreams, visions, and lives marked by geometry none had consciously chosen. The president could not dismiss it. He had been raised with fragments of scripture, echoes of Yeshua's words about a cornerstone rejected yet chosen. And suddenly, those fragments began to weave themselves into the report before him. The Vatican's voice spoke in angles and circles, but the resonance beneath it was ancient and unbroken. Was this what the prophets hinted at? That a design written in stone would awaken in flesh at the appointed hour? He paced the room, aware that to acknowledge it would shift history itself. Nations thrived on control, but how do you control a geometry that breathes? How do you legislate a pattern inscribed by the heavens? His hands trembled over the phone, considering which council, which general, which ally he could possibly call in the dead of night. Yet he knew that no army could intercept a spiral. No wall could hold back the measure of man rising in silent power. And as the first light of dawn pressed against the White House curtains, the president asked himself the one question he could not escape. If the Vatican has traced them, and I have been warned, what power is already moving behind the veil, unseen yet unstoppable? The ancients knew that stone could be persuaded to speak if it was cut at the right angle, not with a voice of syllables, but with resonance, with the kind of sound that lives in silence and stirs the marrow of those who enter. Temples rose across continents, built with mathematics so precise that even centuries later the lines hold their power. Arches rise not simply to lift roofs, but to open channels, to bend unseen currents, to guide the soul into awareness it could not reach on its own. Those who bowed beneath those ceilings believed they were only worshiping, yet the very geometry around them whispered another language. Scholars traced the layouts of cathedrals and found the same proportions repeated again and again, as if each builder belonged to a secret order that carried a code through time. The circle within the square, the triangle pointing heavenward, the spiral hidden in the mosaics beneath the worshippers' feet. All of it part of a language meant not for the eye, but for the spirit. The Vatican understood this, which is why their archivists guarded blueprints as tightly as they did scripture. To them, the geometry was another form of revelation, and to reveal it openly would be to hand humanity a key it was not ready to hold. Yet whispers say the temples themselves have begun to tremble with recognition. Certain ones walk their halls and feel the vibration pulse through their bodies as though the stones know them. Angles shift in perception. Shadows bend. Light arranges itself in ways no architect could have intended. It is as if the geometry waits not for scholars, but for living witnesses whose bodies resonate with its truth. These are not tourists or worshippers, but marked souls who discover that the architecture bends to their presence. The Vatican feared this moment, because once the temple speaks to a living one, its silence is broken forever. For then, the geometry is no longer a hidden code, but a dialogue, and the dialogue cannot be controlled. Governments may track, priests may guard, but stone itself will rise in recognition. And so the question remains, hanging in the air like an unfinished chord. If the angles of the temple are beginning to speak, what will they say when the chosen finally stand at the center where all lines converge? He was not listed in public records, not photographed at gatherings, and yet his presence lingered in whispers that moved like shadows across the marble halls. A Jesuit scholar, older than his face revealed, carrying within him maps that no one else dared to touch. They called him a keeper, though not of relics or saints, but of designs, lines drawn across ages, ratios preserved in silence, scrolls whose ink had long faded, but whose measurements still pulsed with the same fire. For decades he walked unseen corridors beneath the Vatican, where manuscripts too dangerous for ordinary priests were locked away. He alone understood that geometry was not only structure, but prophecy. Every ratio in the vault was tied to an unfolding event, and the patterns converged in living ones whose steps were already echoing across the world. He had traced them quietly, watching the signs appear in reports, in movements, in the unexpected gathering of souls whose very existence matched the measurements hidden for centuries. He had warned his superiors that the cipher was awakening, that the temples themselves would soon recognize those who carried the mark of design. But fear of losing control had made them silence his voice. Yet he did not stop. In the privacy of his chamber, he continued his calculations, aligning maps of ancient cathedrals with modern cities, drawing the same spirals across continents, seeing the web stretch further than any council would admit. He read scripture with one eye and diagrams with the other, and in the overlap he found the whisper of eternity. He recalled the words of Yeshua about a house built not by hands, a cornerstone rejected yet destined to become the head. In those words he heard confirmation that geometry was never merely mathematics. It was destiny clothed in stone and flesh. The Jesuit knew that sooner or later the world's leaders would come searching, not for theology, but for the equation he guarded. He also knew that once the design was revealed, there would be no way to stop the convergence already set in motion. His fear was not of discovery, but of timing, for prophecy is as fragile as it is unbreakable. And so the question burned within his secret heart as he pressed his hand against the cold stone walls of the archive. When the keepers are silenced and the patterns are revealed, Who will rise first to claim what the geometry has been hiding? If you stand in the nave of a cathedral at the right hour, when sunlight filters through rose glass and casts its fire across the floor, you will see it, not in the obvious carvings or the gilded altars, but in the spiral that hides beneath the stones. Pilgrims tread it without noticing, feet tracing the curve of a labyrinth embedded in the architecture. To them, it is decoration, an ornament beneath their prayers. To those with awakened eyes, it is a path. The spiral is not only a symbol, but a map, a coiling whisper of energy that pulls the soul inward even as it expands outward, mirroring the very rhythm of creation. The builders of these cathedrals were not merely architects, but initiates, carriers of a hidden current. They placed the spiral deliberately, aligning it with the sun, the equinox, the hum of the earth beneath. When choirs sang, their voices were caught by the geometry and turned into resonance. When incense rose, it did not simply drift, it curled into the spiral, ascending like a prayer carved into air. Every cathedral became more than a place of worship. It was a living diagram, a wheel turning slowly across centuries, waiting for those who would one day see what others only walked over blindly. The spiral was feared because it suggested movement that could not be contained. Straight lines can be walled, squares can be measured, but the spiral is infinite. It carries the secret that beginnings and endings are the same point, that what rises also descends, that history itself coils like breath in the chest of eternity. Those who understood this hid their knowledge, for to reveal it was to declare that no throne, no empire, no council could break what was woven into the fabric of existence. Now whispers say the spiral awakens when certain ones step upon it. Their presence ignites what lay dormant, the stones themselves vibrating as though recognizing kin. The Vatican has records of this, testimonies buried in vaults describing nights when the cathedral trembled, when lights flickered across stained glass, when the spiral seemed to turn beneath human feet. They called it the measure of man, a drawing attributed to ancient genius. The body stretched within the circle and the square, arms wide, feet firm, as if flesh itself were scripture. The Vatican preserved this design not only as art, but as a hidden key, for the proportions were not human invention, but echoes of a divine pattern. Every limb, every span, every ratio aligned with the same geometry etched into cathedrals and traced across constellations. What startled the keepers was not that the body could be measured, but that the body revealed something unspoken, a code alive in those chosen to carry it. When the Jesuits studied deeper, they found verses that suddenly blazed with new meaning. The words of Yeshua about the temple not built by hands became less metaphor and more map. His reference to the cornerstone, rejected yet vital, mirrored the geometry itself. For in the diagram of man, the central point holds all balance, though few perceive it. Even his cruciform posture was a ratio, arms extended to the horizon, body aligned to heaven and earth, a living geometry of sacrifice and power. Those who carried this code did not choose it. It was written into their flesh before birth, a silent alignment that marked them as different. Their presence shifted atmospheres. Their voices carried resonance that could not be explained by tone or volume alone. The Vatican watched quietly, tracing bloodlines, recording anomalies, whispering that these were not merely gifted souls, but living diagrams of the sacred proportion. To governments, the reports read like curiosities, yet hidden between the lines was a warning. The measure of man was no longer ink on parchment, it was embodied prophecy. The president, when briefed, understood that this was not about mysticism, but about structure, about human beings whose very form harmonized with the geometry of creation. If even one such person stood at the right place, at the right time, the resonance could awaken dormant patterns across the earth. The potential terrified those who clung to control, for how could they govern a frequency written into bone and breath? And so, the question coils like an unbroken spiral around the keepers of this mystery. If the measure of man is the Yeshua code itself, what will unfold when those who embody it step fully into the circle where heaven and earth converge? It began not with armies crossing borders or treaties breaking under the weight of ambition, but with a compass laid upon maps in secret chambers. The thin needle quivered as though alive, pointing not only north, but toward intersections of unseen power. Lines were drawn across continents, connecting cathedrals, obelisks, ancient mounds, and modern capitals. And what emerged was not chaos, but a pattern, a network of precision too exact to dismiss. Nations that prided themselves on sovereignty discovered they were unknowingly built upon the same geometry that cathedrals once guarded. The Vatican's archivists had long whispered that the compass was no mere tool of navigation, but an instrument of revelation. When aligned with sacred ratios, it exposed what rulers could not see, that their capitals rested on ley lines humming with the same pulse as the spirals carved into cathedral floors. Governments grew uneasy when reports surfaced of disturbances along these lines, tremors without earthquakes, lights in skies with no explanation, resonance that made machines falter and men lose sleep. Suddenly, the maps of power looked fragile, for the true authority was not held by borders, but by the geometry beneath them. Councils met in midnight sessions, poring over diagrams smuggled from Rome, debating whether the pattern was coincidence or conspiracy. Yet the evidence spoke with a force beyond speculation. Even the president remembered the earlier briefing, the words about living geometry moving in silence, and now he saw the compass confirm it. What shook him most was not the Vatican's testimony, but the realization that the earth itself bore witness. Those who studied prophecy recalled how Yeshua once said that even the stones would cry out if voices were silenced. Now, the land seemed to echo that truth, for the ground itself trembled when the hidden lines converged. Nations could raise armies, but how do you fight against the design of creation? How do you silence a compass that points not to metal or magnet, but to destiny? And so, the rulers of the earth sat in their guarded rooms, staring at maps that no longer looked like maps, but like prophecy unfolding. The question they dared not ask pressed heavy in the silence. When the compass completes its circle, whose hand will be holding it? Long before the Vatican placed its seal on vaults, and long before governments traced grids across maps, there were others who watched in silence. They were called many names across ages: angels, guardians, scribes. But in the hidden texts, they were simply watchers. Their gaze was not upon kingdoms or wars, but upon proportion itself, the divine symmetry known as the golden ratio. To them, it was not mathematics, but the signature of creation, the breath of eternity written into seashells, galaxies, temples, and flesh. Wherever this proportion emerged, the watchers drew near, recording, waiting, guarding against those who would twist its power. The ratio appeared everywhere, repeating like a refrain, its spiral shaping storms, its measure defining beauty, its pattern locking into the architecture of life. The Vatican kept charts of these recurrences, but even their scholars admitted they did not author the design. They had only stumbled upon what the watchers had guarded since the first dawn. For the golden ratio was not static, but alive, turning history in coils, unfolding events like petals in sequence, each stage timed with a precision only heaven could know. Some whispered that Yeshua himself had spoken in its rhythm. Parables layered in measures of sevens and spirals of meaning, words unfolding deeper with every turn. His declaration that the kingdom of heaven was within echoed the geometry of the spiral, always drawing inward toward a center while reaching infinitely outward. The watchers recognized in him not only the fulfillment of prophecy, but the embodiment of the ratio itself, the divine pattern walking among men. Now, centuries later, they watch again, for the same ratio has begun to awaken in those marked by it. Lives are aligning like points on a spiral, strangers meeting as if drawn by an unseen design, dreams carrying the same numbers, bodies resonating with the same measure. The Vatican writes reports, governments send alerts, but the watchers observe with eyes older than empires, knowing the golden ratio does not merely describe creation, it governs it. In hidden chambers far from the eyes of the world, a gathering has existed longer than kings, longer than flags, longer than nations themselves. They call themselves the Council of Unbroken Circles, a brotherhood and sisterhood bound not by creed or bloodline, but by geometry. Their emblem is no crown, no cross, no scepter, only a circle with neither beginning nor end. For in the circle they see truth, eternity that cannot be broken, authority that does not rest upon conquest, but upon alignment with the design of creation. The council kept no records in books that could be stolen, no manifestos that could be burned, for their scripture was the circle itself. They met in silence, tracing with compasses the same curve over and over, watching as it closed in upon itself perfectly, an image of continuity, untouched by decay. To them, every cathedral, every labyrinth, every wheel of stained glass was a message coded into architecture by their hands or those they taught. They did not seek recognition, for recognition would expose them. Their survival depended on secrecy, and secrecy was sustained because only those marked by the design could even sense their existence. The Vatican feared them, whispering that the council held knowledge Rome could not control. Governments suspected them, sending agents to chase rumors that always ended in emptiness. Yet the council endured, patient, unhurried, for the circle was their teacher, and the circle demanded time. They knew the geometry could not be rushed. They knew the convergence would come when the chosen aligned naturally, without force. Their task was not to create but to guard, not to command but to wait. What unsettled the corridors of power was the testimony that the council was no longer waiting in silence. Circles began to appear across the earth, patterns in fields, spirals in stone, symbols burning into the fabric of dreams. Whispers spread that the council had moved, that the unbroken circles were no longer hidden marks, but signals rising in plain sight. For centuries, they had drawn in secret. But now, the geometry was drawing itself. The triangle was always more than a shape. It was the silent language of balance, 3 points forming stability against the chaos of shifting worlds. Builders carved it into arches. Philosophers saw it in the heavens. Mystics whispered that within its threefold mystery lay the key to power no empire could own. Fire itself seemed to obey it, rising in tongues that split and reunite, always returning to 3. Hidden manuscripts in the Vatican named it the Flame of Convergence, a triangle of living fire that would one day gather over the earth. For centuries, the flame was kept as symbol, etched in secret margins of texts, painted in mosaics, guarded by those who dared not speak its name aloud. They feared its unveiling because the triangle was not an emblem of control, but of release. Once the threefold fire ignited, no hand of man could extinguish it. Priests wrote of it as divine judgment. Scholars described it as energy. Prophets saw it as destiny. Yet all agreed that it would come at a time when the circle, the spiral, and the line completed their hidden dance. In that moment, the flame would descend, not upon temples of stone, but upon living vessels prepared by geometry itself. Some whispered of 3 lights burning within a single soul. Others spoke of 3 chosen ones, scattered across nations, destined to stand at the meeting point of heaven and earth. The president, warned long ago, read the fragments with unease, for he saw in them not myth, but instruction. If the Vatican traced the design to people alive today, then the triangle flame was not distant prophecy, it was imminent reality. Prophecies tied it to Yeshua's own words, for he spoke of a baptism not of water, but of fire, a flame that purifies and consumes. Was this the same triangle flame, hidden in symbols until the appointed hour? If so, the convergence was not destruction but transformation, the kind that remakes the world from its foundations upward. And as the final diagrams are drawn, as the compass closes its path and the spiral turns to its center, the question remains like an ember waiting to ignite. When the triangle flame converges, who will stand within it and who will flee its light?
If you have come this far, it is crucial that you watch this next video here. But be warned, it is not for the faint of heart, for only the true chosen ones can handle this video. If you would like to also donate to help keep the channel going, our Buy Me a Coffee link will be in the description.